one of the things that happens at kids at this age is they do kind of get a little concerned about or interested in their spiritual development. 14-year-old kids are not particularly interested in their spiritual development. Developmentally, they're so narcissistic. You can't be extremely narcissistic and interested in spiritual development. Now, I know some people have tried, but those two don't go hand in hand. In order to really be concerned about spiritual development, you kind of have to branch out. You have to think about other people. You have to have some real abstract thinking skills so you can kind of evaluate this. So really, kids who are 17 and 18 are really much more appropriate for us to focus on spiritual program development. Well, before that, especially if we're talking 12 steps and we use spirituality and stuff, younger kids are not interested. They do their spirituality through their connection with other people. I mean, they're not going to do it pretty much in any other way. The older kids, though, the older adolescents, as they mature, they're really interested in looking at it, and they like to do a lot of things. One of the things that some of my bright 18-year-old kids are doing is they're reading that book, The Way of the Wizard. Like 20 spiritual principles of successful people or something, and they really like it because it's real simple, but it's really heavy, and it's a real short book, and it's written in short, but it's really got a lot to say, and they absolutely love that book. Well, it's a spiritual growth book is what it is, and they like that. Now, I would never give that to a 14-year-old. I mean, that would not make sense to them. They would never read it. But older kids are much more interested emotionally in that whole thing. The other thing that kids really need to feel at this point is that, they kind of have control over those emotions. They really understand them. And the other thing that's real critical to their emotional development is finally the ability and the willingness to accept responsibility for themselves. It's not unusual in early and middle adolescence for kids to say, it's not my fault, I didn't do it. Some of our kids are real pathological with it, but it's not unusual for them to try and get out of it. Taking responsibility for mistakes that you made, take responsibility for your feelings and your reactions, as opposed to saying, you made me mad, but rather saying, okay, I got mad, I should have done something about that, it really is much more of a 17, 18-year-old thing than it is a 14-year-old thing. And I know that we focus on trying to get kids to take responsibility all the time, and we need to move them towards that, but we need to understand that the ability of a 14-year-old to do that versus a 17-year-old, there's a lot of difference. And that's something that once that starts, hopefully that continues to develop into adulthood, and understand we need to try and teach our younger adolescents that. But as they mature, we need to expect that is a developmental process that happens more towards the end as opposed to the beginning of the adolescent process. Academic development, really what kids do at this point is decide on whether they're just going to get a job or get a career. Kids have an awful lot of pressure about what's going to happen to me next. We have lots of research that says, if the kids are firm with that process, that they kind of know what's going to happen to them after high school, no matter what it is, they just have a better time with that transition than if they don't know. And I see a lot of kids who are 18-year-old kids, got them out of school, never thought they'd graduate, and they're kind of falling apart because they're having a transitional crisis. And I think that more and more that, 18-year-old high school graduation, with so many of our kids, that's all we wanted. I mean, we just didn't think they would ever make it, and now that's done, and they're like, well, what now? And I'm going, I don't know. I was just worried about, getting you through high school without you getting kicked out or sent to jail. So now you're in high school. Now you're out. I don't know what's going to happen. Developmental crisis around that particular period, especially if they don't know, what am I supposed to do now? What am I going to do next? If they understand that transition's pretty easy for them. They have a lot of fears about their ability to make transitions. Kids this age are great because they're a lot more realistic about money. In other words, they finally figure out how much a pair of Nikes cost. Okay, at this age, they're much more realistic, and they quit buying. I love them because they're so not so interested in buying like $200 tennis shoes, because you know how many hours you have to work at McDonald's to pay for a pair of $200 tennis shoes. They're much more realistic about that, much easier to work with because of that, and because they start to understand. And they always lecture the younger kids about, hey, you've got to look at that more maturely. You're looking at that too. You're looking at that immaturely. If you had to work at McDonald's to buy those shoes, you'd give that a second thought. So they think they're very wise because that's a new way of thinking. All of a sudden, they're starting to think about things almost like their parents do. They're still concerned about idealism. That is still an issue for kids this age. That's why the coffee house kind of college kids kind of stuff love to sit around and talk about those types of things. Should be able to have really developed some of their problem-solving skills. And should be able to have developed language skills that allow them to converse and talk to people in the real world. You can always tell where a kid spent their adolescence by the time they're 18 about how well they're able to talk. You know who they've been hanging with. I've talked to 18-year-old kids who, it's like these kids have been hanging on the streets because they really never developed their language skills. They still only can talk street language. It's one thing if you can talk street language and talk mainstream language, but when all you can do is talk street language, that's a problem. Now, we have our kids, okay? Our kids, most of us do not see kids who are at this phase of development, I would venture to say. This is our goal. And I'm going to have you look at development this way. This is the goal, not the prerequisite. It's the goal. That this is what we're moving them towards. We should not have programs that require they know this as a prerequisite to be successful in our programs. That if we've been able to do this developmentally or move them towards this, move them from the beginning towards the end of this, then we've done a good job. So look at it more as goals, moving them towards this. That probably if kids are on track developmentally, they wouldn't be with us. They'd be somewhere else. So it's a goal, not a prerequisite from working our programs. If they can't work our programs unless they've got these things in place for them, then our programs are inappropriate for them. Next, I want us to take a look at, and you have in the handout, impact of chemical dependency on the developmental process. I've alluded to some of this as we've talked, and I want to get into this in detail here. Why then do we see 17-year-old kids who don't act like 17-year-old kids? Why do we see 17-year-old kids who function like they're 14? Well, what we know is there are many things that impact development: environment, opportunity, education, parental influence, all the, access to resiliency factors. All those things impact development. We also know that substance abuse significantly impacts development. We know that any type of trauma can delay development with kids, whether it's physical abuse or emotional abuse or sexual abuse. So we know that we end up seeing kids who are delayed developmentally. Not really delayed really very often because of anything that's happened to them, but just that they have not had the opportunities they need to catch up. So let's talk specifically, when we see substance abuse in kids, what we can expect to see from their delays. Let's not just say, well, we know that, they're not mature because they've been using substance. Let's talk about specifically how kids get impacted. This will explain a whole lot of why drug-addicted kids come to treatment and looking the way they look and thinking the way they think. The first thing is cognitive development. Now, this is interesting because there's some relatively new research out of the East Coast that says we know that THC use, particularly moderate to heavy use in adolescence, particularly early adolescence, goes to the part of the brain that's responsible for abstract thinking and retards that process. So we know that marijuana use, THC, tends to retard the process of abstract thinking. Now, we've always kind of suspected that, but they've done all kinds of research on brain development that says, now that we know for sure. And we've always suspected that. We get kids and they're much more concrete than even their intellect would indicate that they should be. And that's because although they're bright, abstract thinking skills require exercise. You got to use that part of your brain. It requires that you participate in the activities that allow you to think that way, and that your brain is free of chemicals. So many of our kids come to us with not only do they not think abstractly, they can't think abstractly. Now, we also know that when you remove the THC, they have the ability to catch up. But what that means is this, that the recovery program as it's dictated, in my opinion, is a very abstract program. These concepts are very, very abstract. So we've got kids who can't use them. So our job is to make recovery for kids specific, relevant, and concrete. Specific, relevant, and concrete, because kids in general have a hard time, but we know that drug-addicted kids have a hard time with that. They have that continuation of that personal fable thinking because they get stuck there, because we talked about they have life experiences that contradict those personal fable thinking, but when you're under the influence or you're stoned, you don't notice that they've been happening to you. So they never integrate those experiences into their cognitive awareness. And their way of thinking continues to be really very immature. And also that distorted cognitions, that once the substance abuse kicks in, they live in a world of delusions and distortions, and that gets played out everywhere. And delusions and distortions retard the cognitive development process for our kids. They also have limited experiences that allow them to learn. That their experiences are limited to their drug subculture, their drug activity, their drug friends. In order to really refine your abstract thinking skills, what do you have to do? You have to read. You have to discuss concepts. You have to listen. It would be nice if you were in school and actually not stoned while you were there so you could participate in the process. There are some requirements. I've had kids who didn't go to school who were real bright because they read. They would work on the internet. They would talk to other people all the time about ideas. But there has to be some way to exercise that skill. Or they've been in environments where they've not been allowed to exercise those skills for a variety of reasons, not been allowed to do critical thinking or think about hypocrisy and all those abstract thinking kinds of concepts. So we need to look at those life experiences that just promote cognitive development and life experiences that kind of retard that. I had a kid that I saw that his dad was a doctor, and the kid was a gangster. He was like a little juvenile delinquent. It was kind of funny because you could tell that he had not been talking to a bunch of doctors' kids. In fact, you could tell he hadn't talked to his dad for many years because he talked like a 14-year-old hoodlum. And that was the best he could do. I mean, he just did not have, because he'd been stoned. I mean, he'd been stoned since he was 11, probably almost every day of his life until he was 17. And you could tell he hadn't developed those skills. He hadn't had the opportunity, he hadn't had the life experiences to do that. The other problem in all these, and this comes up in every single category, the other problem with this is that while kids are under the influence, it creates a false illusion of accomplishment. They think that when they're tripping, that they can think really good. They think that when they're stoned, they can think really good. So they, in their minds, think they got this thinking thing down. But what we know is they can't use it in any practical sense. So we know that even though they maybe have the ability to be bright, their abstract thinking skills are not developed, but they think they are developed because of how they think when they're using, particularly when they're on acid. They think, oh, man, I'm the smartest person in the world. You know, if you haven't tripped, you don't know what I'm talking about. You're like, well, the smartest people in the world don't end up here in front of me. I mean, smartest people in the world figure out a way to avoid coming here. So I don't think I can put you at the very top of my list here. Language skill development. We have a problem. These kids have a problem with language skills. Why? In addition to all the stuff we talked about. Because drug use causes a problem with recall, retrieval, and short-term memory. So recall, retrieval, and short-term memory are necessary for verbal expression. You can always tell a kid that's had too many acid trips. They're with you, you know. And then they're like, over here, they're like, oh, what was I talking about? You know, and they can't express themselves. What was I trying? I'm trying to say something, you know, like coffee cup. Oh, yeah. They can't even retrieve the language that they know is floating around in their head somewhere. You can always tell kids who've had too many acid trips because they just like, they're with you, and then they're lost. They're kind of out in space. You're like, hello. Oh, yeah. Okay. What were we talking about? They have significant, I have a kid right now, his IQ of 180. He's a bright kid. He cannot carry on a conversation because he's had about 70 trips. And I mean, he can start a very intellectual conversation, but he just can only be with it for about 3 minutes. And then he's way over here, looking at the walls, watching the ants, you know, and then he's, oh, what's that? You can't develop your language skills when you live in that type of state. They really stay stuck because they live in a subculture, whether it's a gang culture or drug culture, that doesn't ever learn to use its language to express itself. It continues to use its body as early adolescents do. Your kids come to you, I would venture to say, from a subculture where they really did not learn to talk things out. They learn to act like young adolescents who use their physicalness in response to any kind of feeling, frustration, anger, embarrassment, humiliation, and they're really developmentally stuck that way. And whenever you hang out with drug-using subcultures, and it's true if it's a gang culture or whatever, your kids stay stuck in that phase of development. They're not challenged to use their language skills. Kids who are hooked into the adolescent mainstream are challenged to develop their language skills. That's what I'm talking about. You can tell where they've been hanging out by how they talk. The other thing is that language skills are impacted because academic decline is impacted. They're not going to English class. They're not going there straight anyway. They haven't written, a paper in God only knows how long. So academically, they're not in the places where they need to be that help them develop those language skills. And that's a barrier for them. It's a terrible barrier for them. And so we get these kids who are 14, who are 17, talk like they're 12, very uncomfortable expressing themselves, and we put them in a therapy mode that utilizes talk. And they know that they cannot talk like a 17-year-old. They are embarrassed by that. They know if they've been using acid, they can't even find the right words to express what they're thinking.